Before you start, I do need to ask, I know I abstain from voting. Do I need to leave the room, or do I just need to be quiet?
You'll need to leave the room, and you'll need to.
You're in charge.
Okay, and you need to state why.
I need to stay quiet?
Why?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so used to doing this. I do need to abstain from this item because Aldersgate Development, who is the applicant in this process, is a client of the firm to which I am employed, and while I have no personal direct financial benefit from that client, I just don't want any perceived conflict to exist.
So the item that we are discussing is a request by Aldersgate for waiver of traffic mitigation fees on affordable housing project. Could we have the report, please, Mr. Attorney?
Yes, I'll be glad to give that to you. The city received a letter from Aldersgate. They are the developer for the Cedar Oak project, and have a couple slides here just to orient the council and the public. Here's a drawing rendering of the Cedar Oak project, and then we have a location map illustrating the location. We have Ventura Boulevard here, Cedar Drive there, and Oak Street there, hence the name Cedar Oak. And they'll have commercial on the first floor and then residential on the upper floors. There will be 22 moderate units and one lower income unit. And we received a letter on January 27th, big page 5 in your packet, from Aldersgate, requesting that the city agree to waive the traffic mitigation fees for the residential units. The city's municipal code on this is recited in the agenda report. It's section 1168.070A provides there are no traffic mitigation fees for the lower income household. In regard to the 22 moderate income households, that would be governed by section 11.68.070B, like boy, which says that the council may, upon request from the developer, modify, or in this case, waive, the fee for residential units for moderate income households as defined in the Health and Safety Code. Now, under the Labor Code, Section 1720, when there is a project that is paid for in whole or in part out of public funds, there is a requirement to pay prevailing wages on the entire project unless there's an exception that applies. So here, a waiver of fees would constitute the equivalent of public funds, but there is an exception under Labor Code Section 1720C3, and that's the so-called de minimis exception when the contribution in terms of the public funds is de minimis in the context of the overall cost of the project. Unfortunately, the statute and the regulations do not define the word de minimis, so there is no specific standard. You then take a percentage of the public funds and compare it to the total project costs. In this case, I've been advised by staff that the estimated cost for the traffic mitigation fees for the moderate units would be about $90,000, and that the overall cost for the project is, in round numbers, about $7.6 million. So the $90,000 is about 1.2% of the total cost of the project. That would appear to me to be de minimis. However, since there is no statute that defines what de minimis means, we would need to look to the previous decisions of the Department of Industrial Relations, which I've done, and one of them, as a matter of fact, you may recall, we requested a determination in connection with the grant from the city to the St. John's Pleasant Valley Hospital for some $500,000 for their project for a cath lab, and their project was $77 million, so our contribution there was only 0.65. And so at big pages 9 through 11 is an example of a determination from the DIR of where the de minimis standard was applied. The DIR has applied the de minimis standard, and in many instances the highest one that we have found is 1.64%. Actually, I'm looking at it's 1.75%. The chart here is big page 8, and those are the 10 prior examples of where de minimis has been applied, and plus we have the Camarillo example. So 1.2% would appear to be in the de minimis range. However, there is a announcement that came out of the DIR, and it is big page 12 in your packet. And what that basically says is that the prior decisions of the DIR are not presidential, and therefore you can't cite them conclusively as evidence or proof for the legal standards. So my advice is that we send a letter to the DIR, similar to what we did in the hospital grant, and ask them the question, to give them the information that's basically already here in the agenda report, so the letter will not be difficult to draft. And I've already drafted the agreement itself. That appears in your packet at big page 13 and 14, and you can see from the agreement that we recite the background facts. We indicate that the recommended action and under the agenda report would be that the council approve the agreement, authorize the city manager to sign it. Then after the agreement has been signed, the developer would pay the $90,000 in traffic impact fees to get a building permit. The reason for this is because the DIR sometimes takes a number of months to get back to you on their decision, and we don't want to slow the project down. So they would pay the $90,000 up front. Then we submit the letter to the DIR with the agreement, ask the question, is this a de minimis contribution or not? If the DIR comes back and says, yes, it is de minimis, then under this agreement, the $90,000 would be refunded to the developer. On the other hand, if for some reason the DIR thinks that it's not de minimis, then there would be no refund, because the added cost to a project to pay prevailing wages, the rule of thumb is somewhere around 25% plus or minus. So that would obviously be a lot more than the $90,000 that's being waived. So that's what I hoped was going to be a short version, got a little longer than I expected, so I'll respond to any questions.
Are there any questions?
After that.
Mr. Kildee?
Brian, now the $90,000 is important because we don't want to trigger prevailing wage on this particular parcel construction. Is that right?
Yeah, the reason it's important is if we just waived it like tonight and said, all right, you don't have to pay the $90,000, and then it was later determined that the $90,000 would trigger prevailing wages, then especially the difficulty would be if the project got started and they weren't paying prevailing wages, then all of a sudden there was the determination they had to. It would be difficult to reconstruct all of those payments that would have to be made to the workers to pay them prevailing wage rate. So the reason it's important is we'd like to have certainty on whether it's going to trigger prevailing wages or not. And my advice is the best way to do that is just send a letter to the DIR. That's what they're there for. There's a specific regulation that allows you to ask them the question, does this trigger prevailing wages or not? And they'll answer it just as they did to us in the hospital case.
And just for the record, if it does trigger prevailing wage, we could look at somewhere of a 15 to 20 to 25% increase in the cost of this? Is that?
Well, I think the Public Works Department is probably better able to give an estimate than that. I can say my understanding of it is that it is somewhere around 25% plus or minus above standard rates when you pay prevailing wages.
Yeah, that's generally accurate. It varies depending on the type of construction and the actual trades, but rough ballpark figures, that's accurate.
Okay. Any other questions?
Just a
Yes?
just a comment. To me, this is relatively straightforward. I think the request letter on page 5 from Aldersgate presents a substantial reason why the fees should be waived in this circumstance. Because I'm going back to the original premise, the fee waiver in and of itself, with the prevailing wage as a second logical step. But I do think that the request letter in the first paragraph presents a substantial reason why, in this circumstance, the city should waive it. And then as to the prevailing wage determinations, having been through multiple prevailing wage determinations, I think the provisions of the agreement make sense that the city attorney has outlined. So for those reasons, I can support this.
Any other comments? A motion?
Your Honor, I will make a motion that we authorize the city manager to execute an agreement with Aldersgate regarding traffic mitigation fees for Cedar Oak Park project.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second.
Your
please.
Honor, do we need to also
Please vote.
have the city manager, as part of the motion, write that letter, or is that
That's in-
included in? Is that included in that?
That's included in
He's
it.
going to enter into the agreement that says they'll do that.
That's right.
Okay, very good.
Motion carries unanimously with Mrs. McDonald not in the room.